you want to start adding shadows, what we're quickly going to do is go through here. You want to make sure that your layers are named at this point, because this is where things start to get confusing if you don't really know what it is that's going on. If you have layers that are turned off that you don't need anymore, you might also want to think about going through there and deleting them. So let's try and get everything nice and cleaned up, so at least you have some idea of what these 15 different objects are. It might be somewhat confusing. Now, if I go through and I try to figure out where things are and name them, I might also want to grab all the items that comprise my monster and select them, holding down Shift, and then hit Command G to put them all in a folder like this. Right? So it'll make a folder. I just renamed mine Monster. Now if I turn that folder on and off, the whole thing, right, I can just see what my monster is. Now, to create a shadow for all of the elements combined, instead of just a shadow for, say, the head individually, the body individually, the noodles individually, I'm going to go in and make a duplicate of the whole folder, and then I'm going to smash them all together. I'm going to hit Command E. So I have one version, right, that is the whole monster on one layer, and then I have all the pieces in separate layers. Why do I do that? Well, it lets me create a shadow for the whole thing without losing the flexibility to make edits later on. I love being able to make edits later on. So with my collapsed monster, I'm going to right click, go to blending options, go down to drop shadow, because that's the kind of shadow we want. We can click on the word drop shadow and play around with things like distance and spread and size, right? You might want to try to make it a little bit softer or whatever, right? It's up to you to feel like what makes sense given the lighting in your own composition. When we're done, we're going to go ahead and say OK. And the problem is, this just looks now like the monster is floating above a flat piece of paper. We want to make this more dynamic in the scene. So to do that, we're going to need to separate the shadow from this copy of the monster. Right? We have the monster folder. Then we have the copy of the monster. I want to right click on where it says drop shadow and go to create layer. It'll say that some effects cannot be reproduced. It doesn't matter for what we're doing. Now I have a separate layer here that says monster copies drop shadow. I don't really need the monster copy anymore, so I might just go ahead and chuck that in the trash. And now I have my monster shadow, my monster folder. I'm going to put the shadow behind the monster, because for my lighting setup, right, this makes sense to be behind. If I want to change where this is hitting, I'm going to go up to Edit, Transform, and I like to use the tool called Skew to try to bend this into a position that makes sense for my lighting setup. Everyone has different opinions here. Now, as you do this, you might realize some things, right? I have my shadow kind of set out here. It gave the lightsaber a shadow. I know that lightsabers don't have shadows, right? So I can go in, and because this is essentially just a separate layer, I can go in, we know the routine, add a layer mask, and go into that mask, and do things like, I don't know, erase the parts that we don't want. I don't need there to be a lightsaber shadow over here. Not that we're seeing it. I also don't need whatever weird speck of gray is floating over there, right? So that is the, I would say, easy, convincing way to drop a shadow onto your monster project. Now that you've learned this concept, you can go in and apply shadows to everything that you think needs some sort of, dynamicism. I know that if I had a ribbon hanging on a pedestal, that ribbon is also going to cast a shadow, so I might scroll down to my ribbon. Where are you at, ribbon? There's the pedestal. That means ribbon has to be on top of it. The RGB. I'm going to go in and right click, blending options, drop shadow, give it a drop shadow. Of course, I will right click on that and create a layer from that so that I can manipulate it as I see fit. Edit, transform, skew, right? Oh, I've actually selected the ribbon. That's normal, right? But I might want to make sure that where that ribbon is casting a shadow makes sense in my composition. Same thing, I know these joggers are going to cast a shadow on the cape. Capes don't just have perfect illumination on them, right? If I want to think about this from a perspective of realism, which I know we're aiming for surrealism, I can go to blending options here on the joggers, drop shadow, and again I'm going to separate that by going to create layer, which allows me then to manipulate this jogger shadow to how I think it's going to hit, right? Because I know that those pants are going to cast a shadow on that cape. That's just how light works. All right, that's all there is to it. Happy shadow adding.